thank you all for coming. And for those of you that are watching this on our website, this is what they call a repeat performance because we failed to get the audio the first time around. Hugh is a real good friend of the museum, and his research is absolutely incredible. So I'm going to let him tell you about his research and anything that he wants to say about himself. And I'd like to thank the present audience for coming either again or for the first time.
Thank you, Ellen. It really is my pleasure to share this research with everyone. I titled the talk, Rediscovering My Family's Monument Business and Its Westerly Connections, and it was really quite a journey of exploration, and I was surprised at all the Westerly connections. And I'll say at the very outset that this never would have happened except for all the wonderful work you all do here at the museum, because I had no idea, as you'll hear. So when I was a kid, and we'd drive to my grandmother's in Greenwich, Connecticut, my father would point out on Route 1 this Soldiers and Sailors Civil War monument, and told us that it was erected by his grandfather's company, Lazzari and Barton. And so when I went last summer, I think it was, I looked around, and on the bottom of the base in the back left, it says Lazzari and Barton on this. But I think the thing that this hillside is best known for in town is the fact that in early spring, it's the most marvelous display of crocuses and announces that winter is coming to an end. So literally, that was about all I knew about Lazzari and Barton, although years later my aunt had a family newsletter and did do a short biography of my great-grandfather. And so then we come to the Babcock-Smith House Museum, and I was in email correspondence with Ellen, and she said, well, you know, there's a Lazzari and Barton quarry in Westerly. And I was like, no, I didn't know. And so one of the first things I got shown was this map, which is in the display next door, and has 3 quarries off of Pound Road, 19 being Lazzari and Barton, and then the Thomas Platt Quarry and the Murray Quarry. And it was like nobody in my family knew anything about this, nobody. So then the Lintons, very kindly, Brenda and John, offered to take Ellen and I to sort of walk around and explore and see what we could see off of Pound Road there. And so we did. This must be about 2 years ago now, I think. And that's me walking around. You see there's a bunch of granite around. But what there wasn't was an obvious quarry hole. This is the quarry hole at Murray Quarry. We also went and looked at Thompson and Platt and Murray, and they're wonderful because you can see the various remains of the holes and works that were there. And so it was a bit of a mystery what was going on with the Lazzari and Barton quarry. Had they really quarried much or not? So we'll come back to that at the end of the talk. I'll tell you about what I learned about the quarry. But first I'll introduce Lazzari and Barton, the company, because it actually wasn't a Westerly company. It was a monument and memorials business located across from Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And so this is a Google map showing you Woodlawn Cemetery right next to the Bronx River and now the Bronx River Parkway. The company was formed in 1887 by John B. Lazzari and Horace W. Barton. They formed a partnership. Horace Barton worked at Woodlawn Cemetery, and there's a wonderful book. There wasn't the internet in 1881, but they published a book, The Cemeteries of New York and How to Reach Them. and it tells you how to get to all these different cemeteries, but it says that H.W. Barton was in charge of lot sales at Woodlawn Cemetery. So he was doing that kind of sales and office work at Woodlawn Cemetery. Now, his brother Eugene was a stonecutter at Woodlawn from about 1879 to 1887. That's from the New York City Directory. He's listed, as is Horace W. Barton. According to my aunt, Horace Barton's sister, Josephine, married a man who was also a stonecutter. So there was a bit of family involvement, although Horace Barton's parents and grandparents had been farmers. So it wasn't that there was a stone tradition going back in the family. John Lazzari was born in Italy and arrived at about age 18 in 1872 as a granite carver. He then became a monument dealer at Woodlawn. We'll talk a bit more about that. The company actually incorporated, became Lazzari and Barton Company in 1906. And then in 1955, the company was officially dissolved, which is information I actually found out when I found the property records for here in Westerly for the quarry being transferred from the company to the next owners. So they advertised as designers, architects, and builders of monuments and mausoleums working in granite, marble, and bronze. Their address is most commonly given as 343 East 233rd Street in the Bronx. I put here the two earlier New York City directory listings for John Lazzari because they're kind of interesting. This one in 1881, 1882, it says importer and dealer in granite and marble statuary monuments, Woodlawn, with his home in Williamsbridge. And so clearly, statues and being able to do carving, he was a carver himself. So that was the business he wanted to try and build up. Now, I'm not sure importer meaning what, but anyway. Now in 1884, 1885, there's a sort of confused listing because it says John Lazzari Monuments, Woodlawn, and then above it it says George B. Lazzari Monuments, Eastchester and Vireo, with a home in Williamsbridge. And I think the issue was that his Italian name was not John. It was Giovanni, but people didn't know what Giovanni was a George, and there are newspaper stories where his initials are given as G, Lazzari. So this is the Lazzari and Barton works in 1894, and we'll talk about where this picture comes from in a little bit. But I just think this is the most marvelous. I was so excited when I found this picture. So in the front here, you have all kinds of, oops, I won't push that button again. You have all kinds of finished monuments, a Celtic cross, an obelisk, various things. On the left, you have their office saying Lazzari and Barton and a sign on top and on the sign. At the back, you have a long shed that says Granite Work, Lazzari and Barton, that connects to several other buildings. And then behind the finished monuments, you have a lot of rough stone that obviously they would carve. In 1895, the next year, there was this publication in the Chronicle Mount Vernon talking about our neighbors in Woodlawn that says that Mr. Hines, a piano manufacturer, figured in a runaway accident at Woodlawn last week. He had left his horse and carriage standing in front of Lazzari and Barton's office on Grand Avenue, right there in front of that office, when the horse turned around and ran down the hill, which would be coming this direction. He was caught before any serious damage was done. So, I mean, notice that the street is dirt because this is, you're still horses and not cars at this time period. This picket fence, this side of the street is Woodlawn Cemetery. And here we have Grand Avenue. I'll remind you that earlier we talked about 343rd Street. We've talked about Eastchester, so it was kind of confusing to me what was going on here. Did they move or what was happening? So I was able to sort that out with maps, and it's wonderful when there are historical maps. Now this is a Google map that shows you a blow-up of, whoops, I did it again. That wasn't what I wanted. I think I need help. There we are. Okay.
It should be the center button.
Okay. So here's Woodlawn Cemetery. That's 234th Street. This is actually where John Lazzari's home was, so he lived nearby. We'll talk about that more later. If you blow it up more, you see, I keep saying the wrong numbers, 233rd Street, and you see that here's the Bronx River, here's the train station, and Webster Avenue, and Vireo. So that's where Lazzari and Barton was located. Now this is an 1879 map. Woodlawn was started in the 1860s, and so at this point on this map, this is called Grand Avenue, and this is called First Street. And Woodlawn Cemetery is here. It now fills all of this, but at that time it was this area. And this is the main building of Woodlawn Cemetery, which is still there today. And across the street, there were three locations labeled as works: granite works, marble works. And so this is what would become Lazzari and Barton, but actually at the time of this map, it was owned by a guy named Malnati, who we'll talk more about. This is an 1893 map, and it says Eastchester. Over here in parentheses, it says Grand Avenue, because at this time, this side of the river is still Westchester County. It's about a couple years later that land gets annexed to the Bronx and becomes part of the Bronx. So now this is just in the middle of the Bronx. But at that time, Eastchester Avenue led over to Westchester and over to a town of Eastchester. And when you blow it up further, you see now that First Street has been renamed Vireo, and here's the Lazzari and Barton Works. In 1914, this is an insurance industry map, and these are wonderful because they tell you lots of information. Oops, sorry. So this is Lazzari and Barton, 233rd Street, Vireo. It says this is stone cutting. It says this is the office here. And when I eventually talked to John B. Lazzari III, he said he had visited a couple times as a child, and that his father had taken him, and there had been this old woman who was a florist. So there's a florist here. There's actually also a florist up there, so I'm not sure which florist that he had met. But it just tells you all kinds of information. And over here is a farrier. So horses, even in 1914, were still important. They had the location to put shoes on the horses. Now, this is a map from 1921. It now says Lazzari and Barton at this location. And then this is a 1957 map, 2 years after they had closed, and it's now a gas station. Although, at this point in time, that gas station is closed and it's something else. So, it wasn't that Lazzari and Barton moved. They were always at the same place. It's that the Bronx was growing up around them and they were changing street names as the Bronx grew. So that was really interesting to get some perspective on. Here's a picture looking up 233rd Street. This is Webster Avenue, Woodlawn Cemetery on the left. Based on the buildings, this is from the 1920s or 30s. It was on the web and didn't have a date. And you see 3 buildings here, a couple of which say monument on the roofs, and Lazzari and Barton would be right down there. Somebody who knows their old cars could probably date this even better. The street is now paved. Here's a picture from the WPA in 1937, paving Vireo Avenue. So that's looking down towards Woodlawn Cemetery. Lazzari and Barton would be right there on the right of that paving equipment. And here's a tax photograph from 1940 of Lazzari and Barton, not looking as quaint in 1940 as it did in 1894. But I imagine this is what it looked like when John B. Lazzari III visited it, probably pretty similar to this. And at this point, you'll notice there's a lot less diversity of monuments here and no evidence of rough stone stock. So clearly at this point they're in the business of selling monuments, perhaps still doing lettering, but not carving their own monuments anymore. So this is where the 1894 picture came from. I was amazed to find this sales brochure had been donated by a history professor at Yale to the Yale Library. So monuments, mausoleums, and memorials with illustrations and suggestions by Lazzari and Barton. They did these every year or 2 years. I have copyright notices for a whole bunch of these, but this is the only one that amazingly enough I actually could access. Interestingly, in the back cover, somebody had drawn in a map. It didn't have a map in it, showing Webster Avenue being there at this point in time. Earlier, Webster Avenue wasn't there yet. You just had the train line that came up along the Bronx River. And the railroad station there being very important. It has the monument in Greenwich, and it says that W.L. Cottrell was the architect of that monument. It has pictures of all sorts of different monuments. These are all in Woodlawn, so an obelisk. These carved, what they called artistic rustic scrolls that have fairly intricate carving. And this, what they referred to as a Gothic cross that had very intricate carvings on them. And then here were some marble statues that were done that are actually under a canopy in another cemetery. And this canopy monument, again designed by W.L. Cottrell as the architect. This is actually in Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn. And then there's text, sales. So they talk about the prices that monuments, small monuments can be furnished from $200 to $1,000, and larger ones at whatever price they deserve. It talks about how to select monuments. First, the beauty of design. Second, the excellence of the material. Third, the workmanship. And fourth, cost. And they go on and have sections about each of these. Now around this time, around 1900, the average wage of a worker was on the order of $300-400 a year. So $200 to $1,000 was a lot of money. This is another monument and I show it to you because they reused this picture in this 1901 church journal in their advertisement, and they explicitly say that it's made from Westerly granite. Now we can learn a lot about the growth of the Lazzari and Barton site because there's this New York City builder's record or real estate record and builder's guide that publishes essentially like applications for permits for building and so forth. So in 1888, in the building projected section, they are up here building a one-story frame shed, 38 by 16 shingle roof, costs $180, architect L. Cottrell. So that presumably is that shed that we saw in the 1894 photograph that said Works Lazzari and Barton. This is the announcement that they're going to build that. That same year, they rent this site from George Walgrove for $600 for a 5-year period. They go on to make a number of alterations over the years. In 1911, they purchased the site and they have a mortgage, and there's note of a lawsuit. And the lawsuit is because they had signed the purchase and sale agreement with George Walgrove, and then he died before things were completed, and this lawsuit is over making sure that the estate can actually carry out the agreement. Obviously, then you have the purchase and mortgage listed, so it did go through. We don't know a whole lot about the operations of the company, but there are some information. So this is the Union Goods Directory from 1907 that lists Lazzari and Barton as one of the companies employing union labor. In the New York Department of Labor, I think it was, guide, I found one year around this time when they were listed as having 20 workers, which is quite a good number. I found an advertisement for a leather cutter. I found a story about one of their salespeople moving to another company. And obviously they were erecting these huge mausoleums as well as other large monuments around this time. And so presumably that 20 people included people working there, carving, layering, but also the people who were doing the setup in the cemeteries. I was really surprised to find this 1910 Spanish-American buyer's guide. Who had any idea that even back then there was enough of a Spanish community in New York City that somebody put this together, and that again lists Lazzari and Barton as a source of monuments. In 1909, the Norwich Bulletin published a story about what it describes as the worst train wreck that has occurred in the vicinity of South Windham in many years. And so this is headlined a boat wreck. So this is the train coming down to the coast to then load its cargo onto boats. And in this case, the train was mostly empty except for the car behind the caboose and the tender, on which there was loaded an immense stone weighing 47,500 pounds, and which was consigned to Lazzari and Barton in Woodlawn and coming from Barry Granite Works in Vermont. So it was being shipped all the way down, and the train went off the track. Presumably the stone ended up on the side of the railroad, and the only person who was injured, there weren't a whole lot of people on the train, was the fireman, who did have some injuries, broken ribs and sprained back and so forth. But you know, this is about a third of the size of what I found on the Babcock-Smith website as the largest stone that I think Sullivan Granite had ever quarried. So this really is a large stone in 1909. So they were still doing large monuments at that point. They did do a number of statues, not just cemetery monuments. And so this statue is Garibaldi. It was dedicated in 1888. It's in Washington Square Park in New York. And it has quite a story that I don't have time to tell you. Giovanni Turini was the sculptor. The Italian-American community in New York raised money to have this sculpture put up. It was originally supposed to have 3 figures, 2 on either side of Garibaldi. Because of cost overruns, it became just the Garibaldi statue. And I found a story in the Herkimer Democrat in June 1887, so a year before it's dedicated. Now, Herkimer, I had a look. It's a little town in upstate New York. I have no idea why their newspaper published this fairly extensive story about the Garibaldi statue with you know, an engraving of the picture of the statue. But it was hugely valuable because it said that the base had been changed because of the change from 3 statues to 1, and that the contract had been given to G. Lazzari. And on the base, it actually says Lazzari and Barton, because by the time they put it up, Lazzari and Barton's partnership had been formed. It says that the foundry was Henry Barnard Bronze Company, which was probably the premier bronze company in New York City at the time, and that the base was going to be Clark's Island granite. Now, at the time I was researching this, the Smithsonian website said that this was blue Westerly granite, and so I still don't know which of these is correct. And on the New York City website, as well as the Smithsonian website, it indicated that the foundry was Lazzari and Barton. Well, there was no way that that was correct. It made far more sense what was in the Herkimer Democrat. So when I gave the talk in March, that's where the story stood. But I then emailed to both the Smithsonian and the New York City, and the Smithsonian person got back to me and said, "Oh, thank you for the Herkimer Democrat story. We had 2 other stories that confirm other aspects, including the Henry Barnard foundry." And so they've changed their website to now indicate that it was erected by Lazzari and Barton, but you know, that Henry Barnard, that's 2 names, not first name, last name, was the bronze foundry. And you know, they list both granite types because nobody's looked at it who knows who would be able to say which granite it actually is. And the guy in New York City has also updated their website. He said that, you know, the next time that they got up to do maintenance, this statue is the most heavily graffitied statue in New York City, although not so much in recent years. He sent me a couple wonderful pictures of it just covered with graffiti on the the base mostly, not so much on the statue. But the next time, those were from maybe the 80s or the 90s. But anyway, the next time they get up there, they'll look and try to see what the marks actually say, because nobody had photographed the marks that are on the bronze statue itself. On the base, it does, in one of the photographs you can see, it says Lazzari and Barton. Okay, so then there was the Soldier Monument in Mount Vernon, New York, which I show you a period postcard photo of here. Today, if you went and looked at it, right behind it would be the Mount Vernon Hospital, and it's facing the Mount Vernon Town Hall. So there is still a little green plot, but it's a much smaller green plot today than when this picture was done. There's a story in the local newspaper that includes the contract for this monument, indicating that the foundry this time is Ames Manufacturing in Chicopee, Mass., which was another very important foundry for bronze in the United States, and that the base would be Barry, Vermont granite and a couple other types of stone. And then we talked about the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and I keep hoping that one of these days one of our local experts will get down and see, since it's the only statue actually of granite, it seems really plausible that it would be Westerly granite.
The model that it's made from is a model that was cut here a lot.
Oh, was it? Okay. So that seems really plausible that it would actually be Westerly granite. Obviously, these two are bronze, so it's just the base. They did bid on a monument in Rensselaer County, but they didn't. It went to somebody else. Now, in 1915, when John Lazzari died, his will went through probate, and there was this appraisal done for the company. And so it's very informative about what the company was like at that point in time, the profits and losses over a 4-year period, and then this balance sheet that lists their assets. So the first thing is stock of the quarry company, $100. So I'm not quite sure what that means, but the only quarry they owned was the quarry here in Westerly. They had buildings, they had equipment, derricks and machinery and polishing supplies. They had real estate. That was their biggest asset, $21,000, which would be the site in Woodlawn, New York. In the Westerly tax books, the quarry is assessed at around $800 to $1,000 in this time period. They had various finished stock, various monuments and some marble, and they had office fixtures. And I found it interesting that photo supplies were specifically listed in our $400. Photography was hugely important, as I showed you the 1894 sales brochure and the fact that they did those regularly. Anyway, the company was worth about $50,000. They had the mortgage on the site in Woodlawn and the accounts payable and so forth, so the net value at that point was about $18,000. So now I'll tell you about Horace W. Barton, who was my great-grandfather, and then we'll talk about John Lazzari, and then we'll talk about a couple other personalities in this story. So Horace Barton was born in 1848 in Sullivan County in New York. My aunt indicates he was first a teacher, and then he became the clerk at Woodlawn, responsible for lot sales, so maybe more a salesperson. In 1871, he married Susan Miller, and they had a tumultuous marriage, to say the least. So there are newspaper stories in Connecticut, and even this one in the New York Times in 1884, when they've been married 13 years, a story of family discord, the domestic life of Horace W. Barton's family told in the courts. So the two of them were suing each other over the care of their son. He actually moved to Greenwich, in part because it was easier to get a divorce in Connecticut at that time than in New York. So they did get divorced in 1888, so that's 4 years after this story. And, sorry, he filed then, and it was finalized in 1890, so that's 6 years after that story. And he married Fanny Louise Allen in Greenwich. That was the other reason he moved to Greenwich. She is described by his first wife in one of the newspaper stories as that red-headed woman. She was of Irish descent. And they had 2 children, Catherine and Horace Allen Barton, who was my grandfather, but died before I was born, so I never met him. This is a picture of Horace W. Barton and his son, Horace Allen Barton, who was always called Allen. And my parents very kindly gave me my grandfather's initials, H-A-B, but didn't want to name me Horace. And that's why I'm Hugh. He was a founding trustee of a small private school, the Brunswick School in Greenwich, and a member of the Masonic Lodge in Christ Episcopal Church, which is actually fairly near that Greenwich Civil War monument. It's on the other side of Route 1. He died in 1912 at age 63 in what had to be an extraordinarily difficult event for his family. They were all out of the performance at the Gaiety Theater in New York when he had a cerebral hemorrhage and was taken to the hospital, where he died the next day. He's described as having a genial, sunny disposition and a broad human sympathy that made and kept a host of friends. He was one of the earliest of Greenwich commuters, so he literally lived about a 15-minute walk up from the Greenwich train station, obviously walked to the train station, took the train to Woodlawn, and as we saw earlier, Lazzari and Barton was maybe a 10-minute walk from the train station at Woodlawn, and so he commuted by train for 25 years. After his death, according to my aunt, my great-grandmother, his wife, Fanny Allen Barton, provided lodging for elderly ladies in their large Victorian home. This was obviously something that at the time in the early 1900s, a woman could do to provide herself some additional income, as well as undoubtedly some company. She's listed a few years later as becoming a director of Lazzari and Barton. Now, when I originally was working on this talk, I didn't have pictures of John Lazzari. Now, the only reason I had a picture of Horace Barton was because we had a few pictures in the family, and very few, I will say. And so I thought the only way I'm going to get a picture of John Lazzari is to see if I can find the Lazzaris. And so amazingly enough, I did. Last time when I gave the talk, Anne-Marie Lazzari Beckwith was here, so that's the granddaughter of John Lazzari, and she put me in contact with her brother, who now lives in Delaware, and he provided me this picture of John Lazzari. And on here we have a picture of John Lazzari with his second wife, Anna, and their 2 children, a daughter, Natalie, who died in her 20s, and John B. Jr., who was the father of John B. III and Marie Beckwith. And actually there's another daughter as well. So that's just wonderful photographs to have. So, as I said, he came over from Italy. He was born in Acisace in the north of Italy near Milan in 1853, emigrated to the US as a stone carver in 1872, and there was an obituary in the Bari Daily Times that said that soon after his arrival in this country, he went to Westerly, Rhode Island, and was employed there for about 2 years. So that was total news. Now I looked in the Westerly directories, but unfortunately the ones for those years are missing, so I couldn't find him listed in the directory. He then went back to New York and worked for Felix Malnati, who was a small retail dealer in Woodlawn. Then he bought the establishment from Malnati and went into business himself. So that site had been Malnati's, and John Lazzari worked there, and then he bought it from Malnati, and then a couple of years later he formed Lazzari and Barton. Now on the Babcock Smith House Museum website, there's a 1878 Malnati erected a bust of Mazzini in New York City again, which has a Westerly granite base. It's in Central Park, New York. So in 1878, John B. Lazzari was actually working for Malnati. Whether he was involved in that bust, who knows? But I just thought that was an interesting coincidence. He married Caroline Sage in 1881. At the time, he was 28 and she was 46. It was actually her second marriage. Her first husband had died. She was the sister of Malnati's wife, Marie Sage Malnati. So obviously, he had gotten to know her through work. And they were married for some 20 years. She died at age 66 in 1901. It's interesting what you find on the web. So there's a book that was put out about the conservatory, about the New York Botanical Gardens, and donations that people had made because they had had a plant expedition to bring back plants. And the Botanical Gardens is just a little further south from where John Lazzari lived, and he made a donation that paid for a prickly pear cactus. So he was supporting the institutions that were growing up in his neighborhood. In 1901, he married Anna Rollet, and they had the 2 children that we saw in the previous photograph. They lived in Williamsbridge, and so this is the insurance map for Bronx Boulevard, and this is John Lazzari's house at 3486. At that point it's Bronx Boulevard. Before that it was Lomead. Before that it had another name. Again, the Bronx is growing, the names change. What I love here is, so the pink, it's a brick house, and behind it is very carefully labeled as being the auto house. So this is the 1914 map, the year before he died. So apparently he owned an automobile that had a house. And you see the Bronx River right behind, and a couple of sheds on the property. Now, around this time, he sells the property. The Bronx River Parkway Commission is buying up properties along the Bronx River to partly turn them into parks and partly to build the Bronx River Parkway. He died in 1915 in Coscob, which is a neighborhood of Greenwich, at the home of his brother-in-law, C.J. Sperko. And then again, a couple years later, his widow is listed along with, as a director of the company, along with Fanny Barton. There's a obituary in 1915 in the Granite Cutters Journal, a trade publication, that says that his firm turned out some of the finest memorials in Woodlawn. His fame as an excellent workman was known before he went into business. He was a good union man, and he had many years in business, and everybody thought very well of him. So that's John Lazzari. Now, when you search John Lazzari on the web, one of the things that turns up quite readily is this Bronx River soldier, because there have been several stories in magazines and on websites about it. And I was going to take this out to shorten the talk, except then I looked into it some more and discovered that there was yet another Westerly connection that I just found fascinating. So here's the statue, which John Lazzari owned and had erected on this base. This is the Bronx River immediately behind his house. So it was erected in 1898. Here's another picture showing you the Bronx River isn't very big. Originally, John Lazzari had a wood footbridge that went across here, and that pier supported the wood footbridge. And there's a whole story around that if you want to hear it later. The statue was sculpted by John Granola. It was intended for a plot at Woodlawn, but for some reason it was not accepted, and so somehow John Lazzari ended up with it. So I started looking into I was looking into Columbia Granite and happened to stumble across an obituary for John Granola on whatever trade journal I was looking at. And it said that he had come to Westerly after he immigrated through New York from Italy. And in fact, I found him in the Westerly directories. He was here for about 6 years. And then I looked on the Babcock-Smith webpage, and there's this monument at Gettysburg for the 40th New York Volunteers, put up in 1888, and the carver is listed as John Granola. So he worked for the Smith Granite Company as a carver and did this monument. There's a different picture than this one. Then in 1890, 2 years later, he's naturalized, and his naturalization papers list 2 people who are again in the Westerly directories as being involved in the granite trades. He then went down to New York and obviously carved this sculpture when he's down in New York. And he went on and did things like he carved statues that are on the pediment of the state capitol in Wisconsin, I think it is. Yes?
Do we know, on the Bronx River soldier, do we know what kind of granite he's made out of?
No. That statue actually still exists. It fell off of this base in the 1960s in a bad storm. It was held on by metal clamp that I think had given away. It broke. It got recovered and restored by the folks at Woodlawn Cemetery, and it now stands in front of the Bronx Historical Society's house, which I can't remember the name. It's a colonial period house, but they put that statue there, so one could certainly look at it. It's clearly what these examples show is the movement of people between New York and Westerly, the movement of granite from Westerly to New York, and so it's certainly entirely possible that it's carved of Westerly granite, but clearly the carver, John Granola, had a Westerly connection. There are no pictures of him. Pictures just weren't common in this era, but this bust is on his grave at Woodlawn Cemetery, and perhaps that's a self-portrait. So, as I've mentioned several times, in the 1894 sales brochure, Lance Cottrell is listed as being the architect for Lazzari and Barton, so I was curious about who he was. And it turns out that he's a Westerly native. He was born in 1868 to William Henry and Rhoda Cottrell in Westerly. He's buried in Riverbend Cemetery, having died in 1964. He married Annie Sutton in 1890. There's a long story in the trade publication Granite, Marble, and Bronze about him, titled W. Lance Cottrell, Artist, Architect, Exponent of Expression and Design. And it tells about his life, that he, as a boy in the 1970s, was recognized for his artistic skill. In the 1880s, he then went to New York to the Metropolitan Museum School of Art and also studied at the Art Students League. He took lectures with Professor Ware at Columbia, which I was curious why they listed that, but it turns out that Professor Ware founded the Columbia School of Architecture in 1881. So at that time, architecture was something that often you learned by working with practicing architects rather than going to school. So clearly, 1881, it was new to have a school at Columbia University. And he later went on to work with Harrison Granite Company. He spent 2 years in the drafting room at Smith Granite Company before he went to New York to the Metropolitan Museum School of Art. And they say that he worked for a brief period with Lazzari and Barton, which would be about almost 9 years, 1888 to 1897. He's listed in various documents. But then he moved and spent the rest of his life at Harrison Granite Company, which had a prestigious Fifth Avenue address. And he had a 126-acre farm in Stonington, and they show him here as a gentleman farmer. Now, he's best known for having designed the Pennsylvania State Memorial at Gettysburg. So this memorial has a Westerly connection because it's designed by an architect who was born here in Westerly. The stone and so forth isn't a Westerly granite, but Sam Murray was the sculptor for these bronze sculptures. It was dedicated in 1910, although it took a few more years to complete. And it's described as a magnificent Beaux-Arts design. And I'll just remind you that, it obviously has some similarities to this from the 1894 sales brochure. So this is now about 20 years later that he designed. This is the largest monument at Gettysburg. So finally, we'll return to the Westerly Quarry, because also in the 1894 brochure, there's this section here on quarries. And so I typed it out here. We own large quarries. They were salesmen, remember, at Westerly, Rhode Island, producing the fine-grained light gray or white Westerly and the pink Westerly granite. Westerly granite is celebrated all over the country as the only stone for fine carving and statuary work that can properly be executed in. An inspection of the finished stone in comparison with other materials, we think, will convince anyone of its superiority for fine work. So they are sold, and they are selling you on Westerly granite as the best that there is, no question about it. Having said that, they are salesmen. They go on to say, we have desirable arrangements with all the best quarries in the eastern states to obtain any stone the purchaser may select. And they certainly sold plenty of granite from Barry, Vermont, as I said about the statue in Mount Vernon. But there are advertisements in the trade publications from various companies in Barry where they show work that they did for Lazzari and Barton. So Ellen told me about this 1895 map that shows the quarries, Lazzari and Barton Quarry here off of Pound Road and next to the Murray and Thompson Platte quarries, and next to the home of Gorton Cottrell, and a little further up, closer to Chapman Pond, George Cottrell, who was Gorton's father, his home. There's a map in 1870, an earlier map for the same area that shows George Cottrell's home in the same place. And then we have Gorton Cottrell's home, and it indicates the G.W. Cottrell's quarry there. So exactly which quarry site he was working, I don't know, but there was some history of a quarry in that area. So then the Westerly property records are all online, although for this time period, prior to about 1910, everything is handwritten, and so just the index is online. And so I went to town hall and they brought out the books, and I'll show you a picture on the next page. So the quarry was purchased in October 1891, about 5 acres for $1,000 from Gorton Cottrell and Elizabeth Cottrell, who's I believe his aunt. They had a mortgage for $700 at 6% interest. I'll show you that on the next page, that they paid off quite quickly in 6 or 9 months. And obviously Lance Cottrell played a major role in this happening, since these were his family. And otherwise I don't think Lazzari and Barton would have ended up with that quarry. Now, in between the mortgage and the deed and the mortgage, there's this other agreement, which was fascinating. And just a quote from it here, the agreement gives Lazzari and Barton the rights and privilege of dumping dirt and refuse stone accumulated by the said parties in the prosecution of the business of quarrying stone onto certain swampland lying southeasterly of the lot in return for $1. So the deed and the mortgage say nothing about what activity is going to go on there. This agreement clearly says quarrying, and they have the right to dump their refuse onto the Cottrell land, the swamp just south of the higher land that they had purchased. They're in the tax books from 1891 to 1956, but I suspect the operations at the quarry had stopped much earlier. The land changed ownership in 1955, and that record, as I say, indicates that this was pursuant to the formal filing for the company shutting down in New York. Then those new owners apparently didn't pay taxes. It was then auctioned for non-payment of taxes, purchased by someone and then sold to someone else. And most recently, the property has been recombined with what gets described as the Russell Cottrell farm, except for the portion sold to Lazzari and Barton. So we'll see a little more of that in the next slide. The only other information I was able to find about the quarry was in 1894, again in the Chronicle in Mount Vernon, talking about their nearby neighbors in Woodlawn. Lazzari and Barton will erect a mammoth derrick in their quarry next week. Now, the only quarry they had was Westerly, so that has to be where it's being erected. it also says that Mr. H.W. Barton has been a frequent sufferer recently from attacks of the grip. So I find it amazing that they publish that in the newspaper. They're never listed in the Rhode Island factory inspection reports. So the earliest that those start reporting quarries and so forth is 1905. And originally they only reported operations that had 5 or more men. So it presumably was a small operation. I'm not sure that Murray and Thompson Platt were ever listed in the factory inspection reports either. I need to go back and look. I don't remember them being there. So this is the page from the book. This is actually the handwritten in beautiful script. This is actually the mortgage, and this perpendicular section is the payoff of the mortgage being indicated. And so I thought, oh, cool, now I'll find out where the quarry is. Well, there's a description. Bounded on the south by land of George W. Cottrell, and if you start at this corner and you move across partway, thence in a straight line to a stone wall, thence by said stone wall in the northwesterly. So it's this stone wall to that, to the and it was like, I still don't know where this place is. But it turned out that this was actually very valuable, that description, and that in between the deed and the mortgage, they had this beautifully drawn map, which I've turned on its side so that north is facing up, which tells the length of each of these walls. And so then I went to the Westerly GIS site, and I started researching the property records for each of these properties to try to find out what was going on. And what I discovered was that this large site here, from which this house had been broken off some years ago, originally it was all of this, that's the Russell Cottrell Farm, and the most recent documents, they've combined 4 properties in the land trust, so it's the Russell Cottrell Farm except for the Lazzari and Barton part that was sold, and it's the Lazzari and Barton part that had been sold, being combined in 2 other properties, which I'm not sure what they are. I suspect have to do with moving the road around or something like that. And so then on the GIS site, you can draw lines. So I drew lines so this line is 620 feet on the map, which this says it's 619 feet, and here it says it's an old stone wall, and this pale line is the stone wall. And so this is pretty much this map hand-drawn by me, but that the dimensions match up with the dimensions that are shown on this. Furthermore, what we were missing was here's the quarry hole for Murray and here's the quarry hole for Thompson Platt. And there is an indication of a water hole there in the middle of this property. And when you go to Google Maps and look at the same location here, you see that there are actually 2 holes, one here and one here, and you see lots of stone. And so that's as best as I can place it where the Lazzari and Barton quarry actually was situated. So they did do some quarrying. There are, 1 or 2 quarry pits there, but clearly those pits are much smaller than what you find for Murray and Thompson. So my guess is that they probably didn't do much quarrying, if any, after both Lazzari and Barton died within a couple of years each other in the early 1910s. So I put in this picture of Anne Marie Lazzari who came when I gave the talk last time, so it was wonderful to meet her. I suspect that's the first time there's been Lazzaris and Bartons together in 50 or maybe even closer to 100 years. And so I'd like to thank you all for your attention.
That's marvelous.
You're going to take questions again, right?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Can you go back to the previous slide? And I've been involved in doing some of the research for the Barlow property. So does the Barlow property touch the Lazzari and Barton piece?
I have no idea what the Barlow property
The land
is.
trust property?
So is that this?
No, it's the northeast, along the Westerly Bradford Road.
Oh, up here somewhere?
Brenda, can you help me?
Yes.
Do you think the Cottrell is the boundary? Because I can't remember the names of the
How
boundaries.
far does the Barton property go? Does it go to Newton Swamp?
No. No. There is swampland, but it's not as far down it's before Pound Road. As you're coming from
Right.
California, it's
Yeah.
before Pound Road.
So it's, the Newton Swamp has got to be, I'm not,
Isn't the land trust more like McGowan Corner?
Yes. But
Yeah.
It goes
I think
down
it goes
right
as
away on
far
Westerly
as-
Bradford Road. So I'm wondering if it goes into that old, I don't remember the name from the Barlow research, but I'm wondering if it goes down to that Cottrell and backs up to,
But it probably doesn't go, you know where the Bradford Road is along, actually goes through the swamp.
yeah.
I would imagine the land trust stops before
the
that.
sign
It
is
does.
there, the
It
sign.
does. There's a sign there where it
And
stops.
this quarry is on the other side of that
Yeah, I
swamp.
think so too.
Okay.
Yeah, so this property, as I remember, is either publicly owned or a non-profit of some kind. I can't
Pretty
remember.
wet.
Yeah, it's definitely wet there. Yeah.
I was hoping to make wonderful connections where you had made one. Obviously failed.
Now, do we have all of the pictures from the 1894 catalog?
I'm pretty sure I sent the whole thing.
You sent it? See, we're having a problem printing this out because of well, Linda, you explain it.
Well, when he animates the slide and one comes in over another, when we print it out,
Oh,
we,
okay, so I should have reminded you of this. So I did a version that was called Extended, and that has all the overlays on separate slides.
No, I don't think, isn't that the one we tried to find?
Okay, well, I can give that to you now. The extended, so as I say, all I did was set it up so that each page, has the next overlay.
yeah, we did not see that when we were looking.
Yeah.
Okay, I can give that to you now.